In the fall of 1798, 17 travelers went missing along a 20-mile section of the Wilderness Road in southeastern Kentucky. What makes these disappearances so frightening isn't just how many there were, but that local officials intentionally hid every record of the investigation they came after. For more than 200 years, the truth about the Hardin family's farm stayed locked away in sealed court papers until a county clerk found them in 1987, uncovering the most unsettling case of planned murder in the history of the early American frontier. The papers detail a killing system so systematic, so expertly masked as Christian kindness that it went on for 8 years without being found. Before we go on with the tale of the farm that turned into Kentucky's first house of horrors, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We are about to reveal secrets that influential families attempted to keep hidden for good. Also, let us know in the comments which state you are listening from. We enjoy hearing from our group of mystery lovers. The finding that would finally expose the Hardin family's wrongdoing started not with screams in the dark, but with the simple task of bureaucratic tidying in a dusty courthouse cellar. Southeastern Kentucky in 1798 was a region caught between civilization and the wild, where the possibility of wealth drew thousands to the west along dangerous mountain trails. The Wilderness Road, cut through the Cumberland Gap by Daniel Boone 2 decades before, had turned into the main route for settlers heading west from Virginia and the Carolinas. This tight, winding path stretched for over 200 miles through some of the harshest landscapes in North America, where a single wrong move could lead to death from the elements, wild creatures, or the many human predators that lurked on the frontier. Along this dangerous route, dozens of small towns had appeared like wildflowers after a storm. Each one was a sign of hope for families looking for fresh starts in the wild frontier. These settlements acted as vital stopping points where tired travelers could rest, get more supplies, and find out about the dangers that were ahead. The success or failure of these towns often relied on their capacity to offer a safe place for the steady flow of migrants who came through their areas. The township of Millfield was situated at a key turn in the road, where the path went down from the rocky hills into the rich valley of Beaver Creek. With just about 300 people, it was the type of place where everybody knew each other's affairs, or at least they thought they did. The town had been started in 1794 by a number of Virginia Baptists looking for religious liberty, and their impact was visible in all parts of community life. Sunday church services were required for all townspeople, and the town council maintained strict moral rules that controlled everything from alcohol consumption to dancing. The settlement was centered around Hendrick's General Store, a worn-down log cabin that functioned as both a trading center and an unofficial courthouse. Jeremiah Hendricks, a gruff ex-militia soldier who had battled Indians with Daniel Boone himself, managed the store with a firm hand and a sharp sense for making money. His shop carried everything a traveler might require: gunpowder, salt, whiskey, blankets, and the newest updates from the civilized world beyond the mountains. Nearby was the Cumberland Inn, a 2-story building that was the peak of frontier elegance. Martha Crane, the widow who ran the inn, had come from Philadelphia 5 years before, with enough funds to construct the best lodging between Lexington and the Virginia line. Travelers could get a hot meal and a clean bed for 2 bits a night, along with the kind of refined talk that brought to mind the world they had left. The town's spiritual heart was the New Jerusalem Baptist Church, a simple log structure that could fit the whole town during Sunday worship. Reverend Ephraim Cole, a Harvard-trained minister who had left a cozy Boston position for frontier missions, gave sermons that mixed classic theology with real-world tips for surviving in a harsh land. His being there gave Millfield a feeling of authenticity that drew in settlers who might have otherwise just passed through. Among Millfield's most honored citizens were the Hardins, Ezekiel, his wife Temperance, and their 3 grown children, sons Caleb and Josiah, and daughter Mercy. The family had shown up in the spring of 1791, stating they were survivors of vicious Indian attacks that had ruined their former home in eastern Virginia. They quickly made a name for themselves as cornerstones of the small town, with Ezekiel acting as a lay preacher helping Reverend Cole, and Temperance setting up charity work for struggling families who came with almost nothing but the clothes they were wearing. Ezekiel Hardin was a man who gained respect just by the power of his presence. Standing much taller than 6 feet with the wide shoulders of a lifelong worker, he had a physical stature that made other men move away when he walked into a room. His deep voice could easily fill the church, delivering sermons that brought listeners to tears with his emotional descriptions of God's love and dire warnings of eternal damnation. Those who listened to him preach frequently said he seemed to speak with the conviction of someone who had seen both heaven and hell firsthand. Temperance Hardin was just as remarkable in her own right. A petite, fragile woman with hair that had turned gray too soon and hands that were always busy. She had rapidly become the town's informal doctor. Her understanding of medicinal herbs was vast, and she could handle everything from broken bones to difficult childbirths with a proficiency that felt almost miraculous. More than one family was alive because of her late-night visits during emergencies, and her fame for healing miracles had gone all through the county. Their children seemed to be ideal models of frontier goodness. Caleb, the older son at 26, had his father's impressive build and his mother's kind nature. He worked the family farm with unceasing effort, while also making time to assist elderly neighbors with their own farming. Josiah, 24, was smaller but more scholarly, often acting as the town's unofficial teacher in the winter when farm duties lessened. At 22, Mercy was seen as one of the most attractive young women in the county, with a gentle personality that made her well-liked by both men and women. The Hardin farm covered 400 acres of excellent land along Beaver Creek, 3 miles south of town. The property had taken almost every last cent Ezekiel had, but the purchase had turned out to be a good one. The fertile ground yielded plentiful harvests of corn and tobacco, while the creek supplied water for animals and energy for a small grist mill that helped the nearby region. People visiting often commented on the farm's remarkable success, pointing out that the Hardins appeared to have more possessions than farming alone could account for. Ezekiel had constructed his home with close attention to both coziness and safety. The main residence was a 2-story log house with stone chimneys and glass windows, a nearly unheard-of extravagance on the frontier. The rooms were decorated with furniture that appeared far too elegant for a simple farming family: carved chairs, imported dishes, silver candle holders, and books that indicated education and culture. A huge barn could house 50 horses, while a series of outbuildings contained a smokehouse, a dairy, a blacksmith's workshop, and what Ezekiel called the biggest root cellar in the county. What made the Hardins especially precious to the community was their readiness to aid travelers in trouble. The frontier was harsh to those who journeyed alone or without preparation, and hardly a week went by without someone showing up at the farm looking for help. More than once, Ezekiel had ridden out in bad weather to help with a broken-down wagon or an injured horse, frequently inviting stranded families to stay at his farm until things were fixed. This kind of hospitality was seen as a Christian obligation on the frontier, but the Hardins carried it to amazing lengths. Temperance was especially known for her readiness to care for hurt or unwell travelers, no matter if they could pay. Her medical talents had saved numerous lives, and many families were able to continue their travels only because she had stepped in. She kept a well-filled infirmary in one of the outbuildings, stocked with surgical tools and medicines that most frontier doctors could only imagine having. The family's reputation for hospitality had become so widespread that by 1798, it was normal for travelers to specifically look for the Hardin farm when organizing their trips. Local guides often pointed parties toward Beaver Creek, promising them that the Hardins would offer fair deals on supplies and a safe place to stay for the night. The family's guest book, which Mercy kept with great care, listed hundreds of visitors over the years: merchants, ministers, families, and lone adventurers who had all found a safe haven at the successful farm. But in the stark reality of frontier existence, where danger was always near and trust could be deadly, appearances could be more than just misleading. They could be fatal. The initial clue that something was profoundly wrong emerged on October 13, 1798, when a merchant named Samuel Fletcher did not show up in Lexington as planned. Fletcher was not a typical traveler. He was among the most seasoned and dependable merchants on the Wilderness Road, a man whose timeliness had made him rich in a world where schedules could be the difference between making a profit and suffering a huge loss. For 12 years, he had made the perilous trip between Virginia and Kentucky 4 times a year, bringing manufactured items west and raw goods east. Fletcher's business associate, Thomas Greeley, had worked with the merchant long enough to know his routines by heart. Fletcher never changed his planned itinerary without notifying someone, and he never took pointless risks that might endanger his expensive goods. When Greeley heard nothing after 5 days, 2 days past Fletcher's expected arrival, he was sure something terrible had happened. Greeley's hunt started at sunrise on October 18th, tracing Fletcher's known path backward from Lexington. He spoke to innkeepers, merchants, and farmers along the route, and each of them verified that Fletcher had come through on time. The trail was clear until Greeley got near Millfield, where Fletcher seemed to have just disappeared from the face of the earth. The finding of Fletcher's horse happened at noon on the second day of the search. The unique bay mare was discovered grazing freely near Miller's Creek, still with its saddle on, but with no visible signs of injury or fear. The animal looked well fed and looked after, as if it had been let go on purpose rather than left behind in a rut. Most confusing of all, the horse's bridle had been taken off and hung neatly on a nearby tree limb, an action that pointed to a human hand rather than an accident. Fletcher's saddlebags were still there, holding his trade items and a leather bag with almost $50 in silver coins, a large sum that was a result of months of risky work. The fact that the money was there ruled out a simple robbery, the usual reason for frontier disappearances. Even more unsettling, Fletcher's personal items were laid out in a deliberate line leading away from the road and into the woods, as if he had been made to drop them one after another while being pulled from his horse. The local lawman, Jacob Winters, was a man perfectly suited to look into such mysteries. A former Continental Army sergeant who had fought under Anthony Wayne in the Ohio campaigns, Winters had both the investigative talents and the tolerance for violence that frontier law enforcement needed. He had witnessed enough death and trickery to know that the most straightforward answers were frequently the wrong ones, and Fletcher's disappearance seemed anything but typical to him. Winters put together a search party within hours of Greeley's report, collecting 12 of Millfield's most skilled men for what he knew would be a challenging and possibly hazardous investigation. The searchers included Henrik Johansson, a Swedish immigrant whose tracking abilities were as good as those of the local Indians, and Benjamin Stokes, a former bounty hunter who knew every hiding spot within a 50-mile radius of the town. What the search party found went against all logical explanation. Fletcher's trail led directly to the Hardin farm, marked by torn pieces of cloth stuck on thorns and occasional spots of what looked like blood. The clues suggested that the merchant had been alive but hurt when he was taken from the road, perhaps fighting against his captors who were pulling him deeper into the forest. But at the very edge of the Hardin property, all signs of Fletcher's path simply vanished. The searchers spent hours looking at the area where the trail stopped, searching for any clue that might show what happened to Fletcher. They discovered nothing. No moved earth, no hidden blood, no signs of a struggle. It was as if Samuel Fletcher had been lifted off the ground by unseen hands and taken away into the air. The Henrik Johansson, whose tracking skills were famous, admitted he was beaten when faced with such a total lack of clues. When Winters questioned Ezekiel Hardin about the missing merchant, the patriarch's reply was both helpful and strangely practiced. Yes, Fletcher had visited the farm on October 13th, coming just before sunset and asking for a shortcut that would let him get to Lexington a day earlier. Ezekiel had advised him against using unfamiliar paths, especially with valuable items and cold weather coming, but Fletcher had been determined to try the route. The merchant had been courteous, but in a rush, turning down Temperance's offer of a hot meal and a comfortable bed to press on while there was still daylight. According to Ezekiel, Fletcher had appeared anxious and preoccupied, constantly checking his saddlebags and looking behind him as if he thought he was being followed. When asked about this, Fletcher had said he had seen strange men trailing him since he left Virginia, but had ignored Ezekiel's idea to stay at the farm until a bigger group could take him to safety. The last time the family saw him, Fletcher was riding north toward the ridge country, set on finding a shortcut, even though it was getting dark and the weather looked bad. Ezekiel's story was confirmed in every detail by his whole family, with each person giving the same account of Fletcher's visit. They remembered how urgent he was, how he dismissed their warnings, and even his exact words when he turned down the hospitality. Temperance recalled that the merchant had mentioned stomach troubles and had taken a small bottle of her herbal remedy before he left. Caleb had offered to guide Fletcher to the ridge path, but the merchant had said no, stating that his business was too important for any hold-ups. Their consistency should have been comforting to Constable Winters. Instead, it felt unnaturally flawless, like a story that had been carefully rehearsed and memorized until every single detail was set. Real witnesses, in Winters' experience, always differed on small points while agreeing on the main ones. The Hardin story was too neat, too complete, and too lacking in the small discrepancies that are the mark of a true account. The constable's suspicions grew when he saw major changes to the farm's layout since his last visit several months before. A new smokehouse had been erected near the main barn, surprisingly large for a family farm, and built with thick stone walls that seemed intended for more than just preserving food. Freshly dug earth was visible around several outbuildings, as if large digging projects had happened recently. Most strangely, the family's root cellar seemed to have been significantly expanded, with new wooden supports visible around an entrance that now looked big enough for a wagon. When Winters inquired about these changes, Ezekiel said that the family had had an especially good harvest and had chosen to put money into better buildings for storing and processing their crops. The bigger root cellar was needed for the larger amount of vegetables and preserved foods they intended to sell in Lexington, while the new smokehouse would let them cure meat for both family consumption and for sale. The reasons were sensible and well-spoken. But something about Ezekiel's manner hinted that he was picking his words with extra care. Most troubling of all, the family's usual friendliness seemed strained during Winter's visit, their famous welcome having an undertone of nervous tension that the constable couldn't overlook. Temperance's hands shook a little as she poured coffee, and Mercy kept looking at her father as if she needed his approval for every word she said. Even Caleb and Josiah, who were normally confident and friendly young men, appeared quiet and watchful in a way that suggested they were hiding something important. But without solid proof of any crime, there wasn't much Constable Winters could legally do. Fletcher's case was officially noted as a likely highway robbery or an Indian attack. His name was added to the growing list of frontier deaths that were the cost of westward movement. The merchant's horse was sold at an auction to pay off his debts, and within a month, Samuel Fletcher was only a memory for those who had known him. Yet Fletcher's disappearance would turn out to be just the start of a trend that would haunt the Wilderness Road for the next 8 months, changing a successful farming community into a place where travelers spoke in hushed warnings and parents kept their kids close after sunset. All through the winter of 1798 and into the spring of 1799, the disappearances kept happening with a frightening frequency that defied any logical reason. Every 2 to 3 weeks, another traveler would disappear without a word along the same section of road, creating a zone of terror that covered almost 20 miles in every direction from Millfield. The victims were very different in age, wealth, and travel situations. Lone merchants like Fletcher, small families, and even heavily armed groups traveling in a convoy for safety. What connected them was their complete vanishing, and the fact that each one had been seen going toward or asking for the way to the Hardin farm before disappearing into the wild. Dr. Marcus Cromwell vanished in November on his way from Richmond to start a medical practice in Louisville. The 43-year-old doctor had been carrying his entire life's work in the form of medical tools, books, and supplies valued at over $300, a sum that was the result of years of saving and planning. His wagon was found tipped over near Devil's Fork, 3 miles from the Hardin farm, with its contents spilled but seemingly untouched. Local officials guessed that Cromwell had been thrown from his wagon in accident and had wandered into the forest confused, eventually dying from the cold. The explanation seemed plausible until searchers found that Cromwell's medical bag was gone from the wreck. The leather bag held surgical tools of very high quality, including a bone saw and an amputation kit that would be extremely valuable to anyone trying to practice medicine on the frontier. No wild animal would have taken such things, and common thieves would have been more interested in the coins and trade goods that were still scattered around the crash site. The Henley family disappeared in December during one of the most severe blizzards in recent history. Jonathan Henley, his wife Elizabeth, and their two small children had been looking for a place to stay when their wagon got stuck in a snowdrift just half a mile from the Hardin Farm. According to Ezekiel's later statement, the family never made it to his property despite the short distance, likely getting lost in the storm and freezing to death in the wilderness. Their bodies were never located despite thorough searches after the weather improved. What made the Henley case especially unsettling was the finding of their wagon a week after the storm. The vehicle had been pulled out of the snowdrift and left by the side of the road, cleared of snow and apparently searched carefully. The family's clothes and personal items were missing, but their food and tools were still there. Most confusing of all, tracks around the wagon indicated that several people had worked together to get it out of the drift, an act that would have taken a lot of time and effort in dangerous weather. January saw the disappearance of Reverend Nathan Cross, a traveling preacher who was carrying money for a new church in Frankfurt. Cross was known all over the area for his strong sermons and his brave travels through even the most dangerous parts of the frontier. The 50-year-old minister had lived through Indian attacks, robbers, and many natural dangers during 15 years of preaching, which made his disappearance especially shocking to towns that had come to see him as unbreakable. Cross's horse was found 3 days after he went missing, still with saddlebags that held almost $200 in church funds. The fact that the money was there ruled out robbery as a reason, but it brought up troubling questions about what kind of danger could have overcome such a skilled and clever man. Local officials finally decided that Cross had had a heart attack or a stroke while traveling, falling from his horse and dying somewhere in the huge wilderness that surrounded the road. Each disappearance followed the same puzzling pattern: abandoned horses found grazing freely or tied to trees, scattered personal items suggesting sudden violence or a struggle, and trails that always led toward the Hardin property before disappearing completely. Yet whenever they were questioned by increasingly suspicious authorities, the Hardin family gave believable explanations that were impossible to refute. They had seen some of the travelers, yes, but only for a short time and usually from a distance. Each victim had been warned about different dangers, bad weather, difficult paths, reports of bandit activity, but had decided to continue their trip despite the family's worried advice. In several cases, the Hardins had offered food, a place to stay, or guides, which had been politely turned down by travelers who seemed set on keeping to their schedules no matter the risk. Constable Winters felt trapped in a hopeless situation that became more infuriating with each new disappearance. The Hardins were one of the most respected families in the county. Their reputation for kindness and Christian goodness was beyond doubt for everyone but him. When asked for more information, the boy could accurately recall the rough dates when he had heard the screaming, and each date matched exactly with the estimated time a traveler had disappeared. The connection was too specific to be a coincidence, too regular to be explained by luck. Armed with Timothy Vaughn's troubling account, Constable Winters started to put together a case against the Hardin family with the slow patience of a man who knew that accusing such important citizens would need absolutely solid proof. He began by discreetly talking to other neighbors who lived close enough to hear the farm, asking carefully phrased questions that wouldn't show his growing suspicions or warn the Hardins about his investigation. What came out of these quiet talks was a disturbing pattern of small inconsistencies and unexplained events that had been ignored, dismissed, or explained away by people who trusted the family's reputation more than their own senses. Each piece of evidence was small on its own, but together they created a picture that made Winter's blood run cold. Sarah Mitchell, whose small farm was closest to the Hardin property, remembered several nights when she had seen strange activity at their home, lanterns moving between buildings at hours when decent people should be asleep, and the sounds of digging and heavy building that seemed to go on until sunrise. When she had mentioned these things to Temperance Hardin after church, the woman had given a reasonable explanation. The family was working on big improvements to their root cellar and other storage areas, and they liked to do that work during the cool night hours instead of wasting precious daylight that could be used for farming. The explanation had satisfied Sarah at the time, but looking back, she realized that the nighttime building had gone on for months longer than any normal construction project should take. Furthermore, she had never seen any sign of the huge amounts of dug-up earth that such large-scale digging should have created. When pressed by Winters for more details, Sarah admitted that the sounds had often been accompanied by what seemed like muffled voices, and sometimes what might have been cries of pain or distress. Old Henrik Johansson, whose farm was next to the Hardin property on the north side, reported findings that were even more worrying. The Swedish immigrant, whose tracking and hunting abilities were famous throughout the county, had found animal bones scattered along their shared fence. These were not the usual leftovers from butchered farm animals, but bones that had been cracked, chewed on, and handled in ways that suggested something much more sinister than normal farming. The bones included skulls and long bones from horses, cattle, and pigs, but also smaller pieces that Johansson couldn't identify even with his wide knowledge of local animals. Most disturbing of all, some of the bones showed signs of being deliberately broken with tools, while others had saw marks that suggested systematic cutting up rather than natural decay or animal activity. When Johansson had asked Ezekiel about the strange bone piles, the patriarch had given a believable but somehow unconvincing explanation. Wild animals had been especially problematic that winter, he said, forcing the family to get rid of several sick animal carcasses by scattering the remains in the woods. The bone pieces were just the result of scavengers, and whether breaking down these disposed carcasses over time. With Johansson's experience, I had seen details that went against this innocent story. The bones were too clean, too systematically processed, and spread out too far to be the result of natural decay. Also, many of the pieces showed signs of being boiled or treated with heat in some way, suggesting deliberate processing rather than just getting rid of sick animals. Most revealingly, several neighbors reported significant changes in the Hardin family's behavior and attitude over the past year. The children, once friendly and sociable members of the community, had become quiet and secretive, staying away from social events and speaking only when spoken to directly. Caleb and Josiah, who had once been popular with young people their age, now seemed anxious and distracted during public encounters, as if constantly worried about private matters. Mercy Hardin's change was particularly noticeable. The young woman who had once been thought of as one of the most beautiful and lively girls in the county now looked worn out and prematurely old, her face holding a haunted look that made people uneasy. She had stopped going to social events completely, and when she did appear in public, she seemed to pull back from human touch as if afraid of revealing some terrible secret. Even Ezekiel's sermons had become darker over the past few months, focusing obsessively on themes of divine punishment, the penalty for sinners, and the need to get rid of evil in the world. Where his preaching had once highlighted God's love and forgiveness, it now centered almost entirely on anger and revenge. Several church members had privately voiced their concern about the increasingly violent language in his interpretations of the Bible. Constable Winters also found troubling holes in the Hardin family's background story that brought up serious questions about their real identity and where they came from. While they said they were refugees from Indian attacks in eastern Virginia, no one had been able to confirm where they had lived before or verify the specific attacks that had supposedly forced them to move west. Litch's inquiries to officials in Virginia had found no records of any Hardin family being affected by Indian violence in the time they claimed. Furthermore, the family's arrival in Kentucky seemed to mark the start of their recorded history, as if the Hardins had just appeared out of nowhere in the spring of 1791. They had no letters from relatives, no business records from their past life, and no personal belongings that were older than their appearance in Millfield. For a family claiming to have lost everything to Indian raids, they had managed to get to Kentucky with a lot of money and an impressive assortment of household items. The constable's investigation got an unexpected and frightening boost in April 1799 when a traveling salesman named Isaac Brewster came to Millfield with information that turned suspicion into near certainty. Brewster was a well-known person all over the frontier, a man whose job required him to travel constantly between towns and who had a vast knowledge of events and people throughout the area. Brewster had spent the previous winter in eastern Tennessee, where he had heard disturbing stories about a series of disappearances that had troubled the Holston River Valley between 1789 and 1791. According to local stories, at least 15 travelers had disappeared along a remote section of road near a successful farm run by a family named Harper, Zachariah Harper, his wife Prudence, and their three adult children. The similarities between the Tennessee disappearances and the current Kentucky cases were so noticeable that they couldn't possibly be a coincidence. The pattern was exactly the same. Travelers would be seen heading toward the Harper property and would just disappear, leaving behind only scattered personal items and abandoned horses. Local authorities had suspected the family, but had never been able to prove they were involved, hindered by the same lack of physical evidence that was frustrating Winter's current investigation. Even more chilling were Brewster's descriptions of the Harper family themselves. Zachariah was a lay preacher known for his strong sermons and good deeds, while Prudence was respected throughout the area for her amazing healing skills. They had arrived in the valley claiming to be refugees from Indian raids with no verifiable history before their sudden appearance. The family was known for their hospitality to travelers and had built a reputation as pillars of their community. When Brewster described the physical appearance of the Harper family, Winters felt his blood turn to ice. Zachariah Harper had been a tall, imposing man with prematurely gray hair and sharp eyes. Prudence was small and delicate, with skilled hands and a wide knowledge of medicinal herbs. Their children matched the ages and descriptions of Caleb, Josiah, and Mercy, hardened so perfectly that they could have been the same people. Most damning of all, the Harper family had vanished overnight in the spring of 1791, leaving their farm and disappearing without a reason, just as suspicion about the disappearances was starting to focus on their property. Neighbors had found the homestead empty, with signs of a quick departure and deliberate destruction. Buildings had been partly burned, wells had been filled with rocks and debris, and the entire farm showed evidence of a systematic effort to get rid of anything that might give clues to the family's true identity or activities. When Tennessee authorities had finally gotten warrants to search the abandoned Harper property, they had made discoveries that still haunted the investigators who were there. Hidden all through the woods around the farm were dozens of shallow graves containing the remains of both animals and humans. The human remains included personal items belonging to several of the missing travelers, creating undeniable proof that the Harper family was responsible for multiple murders. But by then, the killers had completely vanished, leaving behind only their crimes and the mystery of who they really were. A 6-month search had failed to find any trace of the Harper family, and the case had eventually been closed with the assumption that they had either died in the wilderness or fled to areas beyond the reach of American law. The implications of what Brewster revealed were immense and horrifying. If his story was true, the Hardin family were not just local criminals who had committed a few opportunistic murders. They were skilled serial killers who had perfected their techniques over years of practice, moving from one area to another when suspicion got too strong, and leaving behind a trail of bodies that stretched across several states. Even worse, their current operation in Kentucky seemed to be much more advanced and successful than their previous activities in Tennessee. They had learned from their mistakes, developed better ways of getting rid of evidence, and created a more believable cover story that had let them operate without being caught for 8 years. The number of victims in Kentucky likely greatly surpassed those in Tennessee, representing one of the most extensive killing sprees in American criminal history. The weight of Isaac Brewster's testimony pressed down on Constable Winters like a physical load, but he knew that as convincing as the evidence might be, it would not be enough to get convictions against the Hardin family in a court of law. Frontier justice was slow, and judges needed solid physical proof before allowing arrests that could ruin innocent lives and tear apart established community. The constable needed proof that would hold up under the examination of skeptical lawyers and suspicious juries, proof that could not be explained away or dismissed as a coincidence. A breakthrough he so desperately needed came from the last person he would have expected, Mercy Harden herself. On the night of May 22nd, 1799, the 22-year-old woman showed up at Winter's cabin like a ghost, appearing from the darkness, her face streaked with tears and her hands shaking with barely contained fear. What she told him over the next 3 hours would finally reveal the full horror of what had been happening at the Harden farm and provide the proof needed to bring Kentucky's most infamous family of killers to justice. According to Mercy's devastating confession, her family had been systematically killing travelers for over 8 years, starting just months after they arrived in Kentucky. But what made her testimony truly horrifying was not just the scale of their crimes, but the methodical, almost ritual-like way the murders had been planned and carried out. The killing operation, as Mercy described it, was far more complex than Winters had ever thought possible. Her father, Ezekiel, had convinced the family that they were doing God's work by getting rid of what he called unworthy souls who traveled the frontier roads. The murders weren't random acts of violence driven by greed or opportunity, but carefully planned executions that served both what Ezekiel claimed was divine justice and the family's increasingly elaborate material desires. The process started with what the family called evaluation. When promising targets came to the farm, travelers with valuable goods, large amounts of money, or skills the family wanted, Ezekiel would talk to them in a seemingly innocent way to judge their moral character. He would ask about their reasons for traveling, their families, their business deals, and their religious beliefs, all while acting like a concerned Christian neighbor worried about their safety. Based on these talks, Ezekiel would decide if each traveler deserved what he called judgment. The wealthy were automatically guilty of greed and materialism. Educated people were condemned for pride and intellectual arrogance. Families traveling with young children were accused of recklessly putting innocent lives in danger. Even ministers and missionaries could be found guilty of false piety or religious errors that marked them as heretics deserving death. Once Ezekiel had made his secret decision, the family would act with the precision of a military unit. They would invite the condemned travelers to spend the night, citing worries for their safety on dangerous roads or offering help with wagon or equipment repairs. The family's reputation for hospitality made such invitations almost impossible to turn down, especially in bad weather or when travelers were genuinely in need of assistance. The doomed visitors would be welcomed into the main house and treated to what seemed like genuine frontier hospitality. Temperance would cook elaborate meals showcasing her culinary skills, while the children would entertain guests with music, conversation, and displays of their education and refinement. The evening would end with family prayers led by Ezekiel, whose powerful voice and biblical knowledge impressed even skeptical visitors. But the final course of every meal contained a carefully made mix of herbs that Temperance had perfected over years of practice. The drug mixture was almost impossible to detect when mixed with strong coffee or whiskey, and it produced effects that looked like natural tiredness after a long day of travel. Victims would slowly become drowsy and confused, accepting the family's suggestion that they go to bed early to get their strength back for the next day's journey. The drugged travelers would wake up to find themselves tied up and helpless in the farm's underground chambers, a complex network of rooms and tunnels that had been dug out far beyond what any normal root cellar would need. According to Mercy's terrified description, the underground complex stretched for nearly 200 yards from the main house, with multiple levels connected by stone steps and wooden ladders. The largest chamber served as what Ezekiel called his courtroom, a grotesque imitation of legal proceedings, complete with a makeshift judge's bench carved from limestone, iron shackles set into the stone walls, and religious symbols that had been twisted into tools of terror. Here, Ezekiel would preside over formal trials that decided each captive's final fate, presenting evidence of their supposed sins and delivering verdicts that were decided before the proceedings even started. But the trials were not just sadistic performances. They served a practical purpose in the family's twisted way of thinking. By framing the murders as acts of divine justice rather than simple crimes, Ezekiel had created a belief system that allowed his family to commit terrible acts while still seeing themselves as righteous Christians. Each killing became a religious duty, and each victim a sacrifice offered to cleanse the frontier of unworthy souls. The sentences given in Ezekiel's underground courtroom varied based on his judgment of each victim's sins and the family's current needs. Some prisoners were kept alive for weeks or even months, forced to use their skills for the family's benefit before being executed. Dr. Cromwell, the physician who had disappeared in November, had been forced to teach Temperance advanced surgical techniques before his death. Reverend Cross had been made to write sermons that Ezekiel later delivered as his own, boosting his reputation as a biblical scholar. Others faced immediate execution, usually by methods that Ezekiel claimed were approved by the Bible. Hanging was for thieves and bandits, while drowning in the underground systems was the fate of those guilty of pride or blasphemy. The most elaborate executions were saved for those whom Ezekiel judged to be the most wicked, a category that included wealthy merchants, government officials, and anyone who had shown doubt about frontier religion. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Kentucky gets worse. If this story is sending shivers down your spine, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's find out together what happens next. Mercy's testimony laid bare the systematic nature of the family's crimes in frightening detail. Each member had been given specific jobs in both the murders and the elaborate cover-up that came after. Caleb and Josiah were the muscle of the operation, in charge of capturing victims, maintaining the underground complex, and getting rid of bodies through a limestone cave system that connected to the deepest parts of the dugout chambers. Their size and strength made them perfect for the physical work of moving unconscious prisoners and heavy loads of earth and stone. Mercy herself had been forced to be the family's record keeper, keeping detailed ledgers that documented every victim's identity, possessions, and how they were disposed of. Her neat handwriting filled dozens of notebooks with information that read like a merchant's inventory, except that the goods being listed were human lives and the transactions were murders. Each entry included the victim's name, age, appearance, estimated wealth, and personal belongings, along with notes about their final words and behavior while they were imprisoned. Temperance's role was perhaps the most vital to the operation's success. Besides making the drugs that incapacitated victims, she was the family's medical expert, keeping prisoners alive when their skills were needed and making sure that executions went smoothly without creating evidence. Her knowledge of anatomy, which she gained through years of frontier medical practice, had been twisted into an expertise in torture and murder. Most chillingly, Temperance had developed what she called treatments for prisoners who were uncooperative or tried to escape. These punishments were designed to break their will without killing them, using techniques that combined her medical knowledge with psychological torture. Prisoners who refused to follow the family's orders would be subjected to calculated doses of pain and terror until they became completely obedient. The family's success in not getting caught had relied on more than just careful planning. It required a complex system of disposal and deception that got rid of all evidence of their crimes. Bodies were never buried on the farm property itself, but were instead moved through the cave system to distant limestone caverns that were several miles from the homestead. These natural chambers provided perfect conditions for decomposition, while their distance from the farm made discovery almost impossible. Personal belongings were sorted with the efficiency of experienced merchants. Valuable items, money, jewelry, fine weapons, and tools were either kept by the family or sold in faraway markets where they couldn't be traced back to missing people. Less valuable objects were carefully scattered along roads throughout the area, creating false trails that suggested robbery or Indian attack. Even the victim's clothing was processed systematically, with useful garments kept for the family's use while distinctive items were destroyed to prevent identification. The horses were a particular problem since they were both valuable and easily recognized by people who knew the victims. The family had built relationships with dishonest horse traders in distant counties who didn't ask questions about the animals' origins. By selling the horses far from where their owners had disappeared, the Hardens created more false trails that further confused investigations. But perhaps the most clever part of their deception was how they used their charitable acts to turn away suspicion. Every act of kindness, every medical treatment given by temperance, every sermon delivered by Ezekiel served two purposes. They genuinely helped the community while building a reputation that made the family virtually above suspicion. Who would believe that people who saved lives during epidemics could be responsible for systematic murder? The family had even made backup plans for different kinds of investigations. If authorities became too suspicious, they would temporarily stop their killing activities while increasing their charity work to strengthen their reputation. They had identified several escape routes that would let them leave the farm quickly if discovery seemed likely, just as they had done when leaving Tennessee years before. According to Mercy, the family had been planning to greatly expand their operations. They had found several other remote farms along the wilderness road where similar trials could be held, creating a network of killing sites that would let them operate with even more freedom. The ultimate goal was to set up what Ezekiel called courts of divine justice all over the frontier, getting rid of unworthy travelers on a scale that would reshape the moral character of the whole region. But what finally pushed Mercy to confess was not a moral awakening or a sudden change of heart. It was fear for her own life. She revealed that Ezekiel had become increasingly paranoid about being discovered and had started to see anyone who might be a threat as deserving of judgment. That list now included several neighbors who had asked too many questions, Isaac Brewster, the peddler who had been asking about the Tennessee disappearances, and even Constable Winters himself. More immediately terrifying, Mercy disclosed that another victim was currently being held in the underground chambers. A traveling surveyor named William Patterson, who had been captured 3 days earlier and was set for trial the next night. But Patterson was not the only prisoner in the family's hand. Unknown to the outside world, they were also holding two other captives. A young woman named Rebecca Foster, who had been missing for over a week, and an elderly man identified as Luther Grimby, a traveling preacher who had disappeared the previous month. The revelation that multiple victims were being held at the same time showed how confident the family had become in their methods and how dramatically they had escalated their activity. What had started as opportunistic murders of lone travelers had turned into something close to an industrial killing operation, with prisoners being held, sorted, and executed according to a detailed schedule that treated human life as raw material for the family's twisted goals. Winters realized that time had run out for careful investigation and legal steps. If Mercy's information was correct, innocent people were going to die within hours unless immediate action was taken. But he also knew that a direct confrontation with the Harden family would be incredibly dangerous. They were armed, ready for a fight, and operating from a fortified position they had spent years perfecting for exactly this kind of situation. Constable Winters faced the hardest decision of his law enforcement career. Knowing that every choice had deadly outcomes, he could try to arrest the Harden family by himself, risking not only his own life, but also possibly tipping them off to escape before their current victims could be rescued. On the other hand, he could ride to Lexington for backup, which would almost certainly doom Patterson, Foster, and Grimby to death, while giving the Hardens time to destroy evidence and run to another area where they could start their killing spree again. The choice became easier when Winters realized he wouldn't have to act by himself. Henrik Johansson, the Swedish farmer whose suspicions had been growing for months, volunteered right away when asked for help. The immigrant's military experience in the Swedish army and his detailed knowledge of the local area made him a priceless ally for what would essentially be a combat mission. Isaac Brewster also offered his help, driven by guilt over his failure to expose the Harper family's crimes in Tennessee years before. The peddler's knowledge of the family's previous methods and his experience with frontier violence would be crucial in predicting how they would likely respond to an attack. Two other men from town, Benjamin Stokes, the former bounty hunter, and Daniel Crawford, a veteran of Indian fighting, completed the quickly formed rescue party. The plan they came up with was necessarily simple but extremely risky. The group would approach the Hardin farm after midnight on May 23rd, using darkness and surprise to overcome the family's defensive advantages. Their main goal was to rescue the imprisoned victims, with capturing the killers being a secondary concern. If the Hardins could not be taken alive, the rescuers were prepared to use whatever force was needed to stop their escape. Mercy provided vital information about the farm's layout and the family's likely defensive spots. The underground complex had only two entrances. The main one through the enlarged root cellar and a hidden emergency exit that came out in the woods nearly a quarter-mile from the main house. The family kept weapons stored at both locations, and Ezekiel had trained his sons in defensive tactics designed to hold off attackers long enough for the family to escape through the cave system. The approach to the farm required crossing nearly a mile of open land that would leave the rescuers completely exposed if they were seen. Johansson's tracking skills were invaluable in finding a route that used creek beds and tree lines to provide the most cover. The group moved with the silence of experienced hunters, each man knowing that being discovered would likely mean death for both themselves and the prisoners they were trying to save. What they found when they got to the Hardin property was worse than their worst fears, and confirmed that Mercy's testimony had actually downplayed the scale of her family's crimes. The farm showed clear signs of recent digging far beyond what any normal agricultural operation would need. Piles of earth and stone were scattered all over the property, while the smell of lime and decay hung in the air like a physical presence. The main house looked normal from the outside, with warm light in the windows and smoke rising from the chimneys. But as the rescuers got closer, they could hear sounds that chilled their blood, muffled voices coming from under the ground, occasional screams that were quickly silenced, and the rhythmic sound of metal hitting stone that suggested ongoing work in the underground chambers. The rescue operation started at exactly 2:00 a.m., when the raiders thought the family would be least awake and most vulnerable to a surprise attack. Winters and Johansson went to the main entrance of the underground complex, while Stokes and Crawford positioned themselves to block the emergency exit. Brewster stayed with the horses, ready to provide covering fire if the operation went wrong. The root cellar entrance turned out to be far more complex than Mercy had described. What looked from the surface like a simple storage area was actually a sophisticated fortification with multiple defensive positions and clear lines of fire. The Hardins had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of assault, creating killing zones that would let a small number of defenders hold off a much larger attacking force. But the raiders' greatest advantage was complete surprise. The family had grown complacent after years of successful operation, never thinking that their carefully maintained cover could be broken by local law enforcement. When Winters and Johansson went down into the underground complex, they found Ezekiel and his sons completely unprepared for a fight, focused instead on the gruesome business of getting their current victims ready for execution. The rescue of the prisoners was both easier and more horrifying than the raiders had expected. They found William Patterson chained in a stone cell barely big enough for a man to stand up, weak from days without enough food, but alive and coherent. Rebecca Foster was in worse shape, showing signs of the treatments that Temperance had used to break her resistance. Luther Grimby was barely conscious, his health destroyed by weeks of captivity and psychological torture. But the prisoners were not the only ones in the underground complex. As the raiders went deeper into the cave system, they found evidence of the family's crimes that was beyond human understanding. The limestone chambers held a charnel house of human remains from nearly a decade of systematic murder. Bones, pieces of clothing, and personal items were scattered throughout multiple rooms, creating an archaeological record of atrocity that would take weeks to fully document. The physical evidence was overwhelming in both its scale and detail. Besides the human remains, the raiders found the detailed records that Mercy had described, written in her neat handwriting, and organized with the precision of a merchant's ledger. The notebooks contain the names, descriptions, and final possessions of 67 victims spanning 8 years, far more than the investigation had uncovered, and representing one of the most extensive killing sprees in American criminal history. But perhaps the most damning evidence was found in what Ezekiel had called his courtroom. The underground chamber contained not only the makeshift judge's bench and religious symbols that Mercy had described, but also a collection of personal trophies taken from victims. Scalps, jewelry, weapons, and other mementos were displayed like battle honors, creating a museum of murder that revealed the full extent of the family's sadistic pride in their crimes. The capture of the Hardin family was quick but violent, as Ezekiel and his sons tried to fight their way out of the underground complex rather than face the justice they had denied their victims. The patriarch showed no surprise at being found out. Instead, he launched into a rambling sermon about divine judgment and the righteousness of his mission. Even as gunfire echoed through the stone chambers, Caleb and Josiah fought with the desperate fury of men who knew they faced certain death if captured. Using their intimate knowledge of the cave system to launch attacks from hidden positions, the battle raged through multiple chambers for nearly an hour, with the raiders forced to advance carefully through passages that the defenders had prepared as killing zones. The end came when Temperance, trapped in the main house above, tried to destroy evidence by setting fire to the building and its contents. The flames spread quickly through the dry timber structure, threatening to collapse the main entrance to the underground complex and trap everyone below. Faced with a choice between burning alive and surrendering, the surviving Hardins finally put down their weapons. Only Mercy surrendered willingly, her confession having already condemned her family and sealed their fate. She was found in her room kneeling in prayer, apparently resigned to whatever judgment awaited her. Her cooperation with the investigation had been motivated not by a moral change, but by terror that her father's paranoia would eventually mark her for execution, along with the family's other perceived enemies. The aftermath of the Hardin family's capture sent shockwaves throughout Kentucky and the wider frontier region, forcing communities to confront the terrifying reality that one of their most respected families had been systematically murdering travelers for nearly a decade. The evidence recovered from the underground complex was so overwhelming and disturbing that local authorities struggled to process the full scope of the crimes. The investigation that followed the raid revealed details that surpassed even the raiders' worst expectations. The cave system beneath the Hardin farm was far more extensive than anyone had imagined, stretching for nearly 2 miles through natural limestone caverns that the family had modified for their murderous purposes. Multiple chambers had been dug out and reinforced, creating an underground complex that could hold dozens of prisoners at once. The physical evidence recovered from these chambers painted a picture of systematic murder that spanned not just the 8 years. The family had lived in Kentucky, but potentially decades of similar crimes in other territories. Besides the 67 victims documented in Mercy's neat records, searchers found personal effects and human remains that suggested the true number of murders was significantly higher. Particularly disturbing was the discovery of children's clothing and toys among the recovered evidence, indicating that entire families had been murdered, not just individual travelers. The Henley family, who had disappeared during the December blizzard, were found to have been held in the underground complex for over a week before being executed. Their children, ages 6 and 8, had been kept alive for several days after their parents' deaths before being killed and their bodies disposed of in the deepest. The trial of the Hardin family began in late June 1799 and lasted for nearly a month, drawing spectators from across Kentucky and the surrounding territories. The courthouse in Lexington was packed daily with crowds that included victims' relatives, curious onlookers, and legal experts who recognized the case as unprecedented in American criminal history. The evidence presented was so overwhelming and disturbing that the presiding judge, Honorable Samuel Whitmore, ordered parts of the testimony sealed from public view. Ezekiel Hardin's behavior during the trial shocked even experienced court observers. Instead of showing remorse for his crimes or trying to downplay his family's responsibility, He used his testimony as a chance to deliver long sermons about divine justice and the righteousness of his mission. He claimed that every murder had been sanctioned by God as part of a holy war against sin and corruption on the frontier. According to Ezekiel's twisted theology, he and his family had been chosen as instruments of divine judgment, tasked with eliminating unworthy souls who posed a threat to the moral order of Christian civilization. The money and goods taken from victims weren't theft, but righteous payment for their sacred work. The elaborate underground complex wasn't a prison, but a courthouse where God's justice was administered according to biblical principles. His wife and sons maintained their innocence despite overwhelming evidence, insisting they had been forced to participate by Ezekiel's religious fanaticism and threats of violence. Temperance claimed that her medical knowledge had been used against her will to keep prisoners alive, while Caleb and Josiah testified that their father had convinced them they were fighting a holy war against agents of Satan who threatened their community. These claims were contradicted by extensive evidence showing that all family members had participated willingly and enthusiastically in the murders. Mercy's detailed records included notes in different handwritings, indicating that each family member had contributed to documenting their crimes. Personal items found in their rooms included trophies taken from victims, suggesting that the killings provided psychological satisfaction rather than just material gain. Only Mercy Harden expressed genuine remorse for her role in the murders, though her testimony revealed that her cooperation with authorities had been motivated primarily by fear rather than a moral change. She provided crucial details about the family's methods and helped identify many of the victims whose remains had been found in the cave system. Her willingness to testify against her family members earned her a degree of mercy from prosecutors, though she would still face severe punishment for her participation in the crimes. The sentences handed down by Judge Whitmore were swift and decisive, reflecting both the severity of the crimes and the community's demand for justice. Ezekiel, Temperance, Caleb, and Josiah Harden were all condemned to death by hanging, with the execution scheduled for August 15, 1799. The date was chosen deliberately. It marked exactly 1 year since Samuel Fletcher's disappearance had first exposed the family's crimes and begun the investigation that led to their capture. Mercy Harden received a sentence of life imprisonment, sparing her from execution in exchange for her cooperation with authorities in her youth at the time many of the crimes were committed. She would spend the remaining 43 years of her life in the Kentucky State Penitentiary, becoming one of the longest-serving prisoners in the institution's history.